The silence in Harmony Creek wasn't peace. It was a weapon forged over generations. I grew up complicit until one song forced me to choose between a lifetime of loyalty and a single, devastating moment of truth. The silence in Harmony Creek was a lie. It was a carefully constructed, neatly painted facade over a rot that went straight to the town's foundations. We called it tradition. We called it heritage. But it was just a prettier word for hate. I grew up breathing it in, thinking it was just the air. My father was the unofficial gatekeeper of this tradition. He wasn't the mayor, but his word carried more weight than any elected officials. He ran the hardware store, sat on every committee, and his family had been here since the town was nothing but a trading post and a church. "We keep to ourselves, son," he'd tell me, his voice a low, certain rumble. "We take care of our own. That's what keeps this place special." Our own was a very specific type of person. White, Christian, families who could trace their roots back at least 3 generations in the county cemetery. Anyone else was an outsider, a temporary disruption to be weathered and waited out like a bad storm. I remember when the Garcias tried to open a small grocery store on Main Street. They were good people, worked hard. But the whispers started. My dad would talk to his friends over coffee, their voices low. "It's a different culture," he'd say, shaking his head. "It changes the character of the town." Within 6 months, the Garcias' windows were broken twice, their suppliers were mysteriously always late, and no one from the right family shopped there. They packed up and left, their dreams shattered. My father just nodded grimly, as if he'd predicted a harsh winter, and it had arrived right on schedule. I was 16 then, and I didn't question it. It was just the way things were. Then Lena arrived. She moved in with her grandmother, a quiet, elderly woman who'd lived on the edge of town for years, but was mostly ignored. Lena was different. She was black, for starters, which made her an instant curiosity in our high school of 500 nearly identical faces. But it was more than that. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that was unnerving. She didn't try to fit in, didn't shrink under the cold stares in the hallway, or the way students would suddenly fall silent when she walked into the cafeteria. She'd just find an empty table, pull out a worn notebook and a pen, and disappear into her own world. My friends, parroting their parents, were merciless. They called her Shadow, Ghost, things I'm ashamed to even think now. I never joined in, but I never stopped them either. My silence was its own kind of poison. I'd watch her from across the lunchroom, this girl who was an island in a hostile sea, and a part of me I didn't understand felt a flicker of something. Not pity, but respect. She had a strength we didn't. We were a pack, drawing our courage from each other. She stood alone. The flashpoint was the annual Founders' Day festival. It was the biggest event of the year, a celebration of Harmony Creek's history. Our version of it, anyway. There was a parade, a barbecue, and a talent show on the old town square stage. It was usually the same acts every year, some cringe-worthy magic tricks. A girl who twirled a baton, the barbershop quartet my father sang in. It was a ritual of self-congratulation. This year, to everyone's shock, a new name appeared on the sign-up sheet posted in the town hall. Lena Washington. The news spread like a virus. Laughter and mockery followed. "What's she gonna do? Recite poetry?" one of my friends sneered. My father was furious. He saw it as a deliberate provocation. "This is our celebration," he fumed at the dinner table. "It's about our heritage. She has no place on that stage. She's trying to make a statement, trying to stir up trouble." He saw a threat in everything she did. Her quietness wasn't shyness, it was plotting. Her solitude wasn't isolation, it was arrogance. The night of the talent show, the air was thick with a smug, tense energy. The whole town was there, packed onto folding chairs and blankets on the lawn. It felt less like a community gathering, and more like a public shaming waiting to happen. I sat with my parents, my stomach in knots. When the announcer, a nervous man who owned the local insurance agency, called Lena's name, a wave of whispers and snickers rippled through the crowd. My father crossed his arms, a stony expression on his face, a general ready for a battle he was certain he'd already won. Lena walked onto the stage. She wasn't wearing a fancy dress, just jeans and a simple t-shirt. She carried an old, slightly beat-up acoustic guitar. She didn't look at the crowd. She just walked to the single microphone stand, adjusted it, and took a deep breath. There was no introduction, no nervous pleasantries. The silence stretched, heavy and hostile. I saw my friend Kevin make a gesture of choking to the guy next to him, and they both stifled a laugh. My dad shook his head, a little smirk playing on his lips. Lena closed her eyes for a second, a flicker of vulnerability that was gone as soon as it appeared. She placed her fingers on the strings, and the first chord she strummed wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring and silenced the entire square. It was a note of such profound sadness and defiance that it felt like a physical thing in the air. And then she opened her mouth to sing, and the first line she sang was not a melody. It was an accusation, and it was aimed directly at us. Her voice wasn't polished like the ones on the radio. It was raw, like unvarnished wood, with a slight tremor that wasn't from fear, but from the weight of the words she was singing. "They call this harmony, but I only hear the screaming," she sang, her voice growing stronger with each word. The melody was simple, mournful, like a folk song that had been passed down for 100 years, but the lyrics were brand new, forged in the fire of her own experience here. My father's jaw tightened. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Beside me, my mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The song continued, a quiet, devastating indictment of our town. Lena sang about the neat white fences that were really walls, and the friendly smiles that hid suspicious eyes. She sang about the stories we told ourselves, our precious heritage, and she held them up to the light, showing the cracks and the rot we all pretended not to see. Every word was a pebble thrown at the glass house of my own conscience. Then came the second verse, and the air got so thin I could barely breathe. "Saw the windows broken on a dreamer's store," she sang, her eyes finally sweeping across the crowd, not with anger, but with a deep, knowing sadness. "Heard the whispers saying, they don't belong no more. Watched a family pack their hope into a dusty car. Is that the kind of harmony you really are?" She was singing about the Garcias. She wasn't even here when it happened, but she knew. Her grandmother must have told her. She was singing our town's secret history, a story we'd all conspired to forget, and she was doing it on our most sacred day, on our stage, in front of everyone. I risked a glance around. The smugness had evaporated from the crowd. People were staring at their feet, at their hands, anywhere but at the girl on the stage who was holding up a mirror to their souls. They knew exactly who she was talking about. I saw Mr. Henderson, who owned the biggest farm in the county and had been the first to stop supplying the Garcias, staring at the stage with his mouth slightly agape, a look of pure shock on his face. My father's knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of his chair. He was vibrating with a rage so potent I could feel it. This was more than just a song to him. It was an insurrection. It was a direct challenge to the order he had spent his entire life upholding. Lena was tearing down the facade, brick by brick, with nothing but a beat-up guitar and the truth. The final chorus was a whisper that carried more power than a shout. "The silence is a heavy stone that you all carry, all alone. You think it keeps your garden safe, but it just buries all your grace." She strummed one last lingering chord that hung in the humid night air like a question. And then she stopped. The silence that rushed back in wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of everything that had just been said. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Nobody booed. We were all frozen, suspended in the space between the town we thought we were and the town she had just shown us. It was the most honest moment Harmony Creek had experienced in 100 years. Then a single sound cut through the stillness, the scraping of a metal chair against grass. It was my father. He was standing up. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes fixed on Lena with a terrifying intensity. He looked like a man who was about to personally tear down the stage. The entire town turned to watch him, holding their collective breath, waiting for the explosion they all knew was coming. He took one step forward, then another, his dress shoes sinking slightly into the soft lawn as he began to walk, purposefully, unstoppably, toward the stage. My mother grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. He shook her off without even looking at her. and as I watched my father march towards that lone girl and her guitar, a war ignited inside me, a terrifying clash between a lifetime of loyalty and a single moment of truth. Before I knew what I was doing, my own body was moving, my legs pushing me up from my chair. My feet were moving before my brain could catch up, carrying me down the aisle between the folding chairs. I heard my mother's gasp, a sharp intake of breath. The murmuring of the crowd fell silent again, replaced by a new, more intense shock. I wasn't just the hardware store owner's son anymore. I was part of the spectacle. I reached the front of the stage just as my father did, and I stepped directly into his path, placing myself between him and Lena. "Get out of my way, son," he said, his voice dangerously low, a growl that promised consequences. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were still locked on Lena, who stood perfectly still on the stage, her guitar held loose in one hand. She was watching us, her expression unreadable. "No," I said. The word felt foreign in my mouth, heavy and solid. I'd never said it to him before. Not like this. He finally turned his gaze on me, and the full force of his fury hit me like a physical blow. His face was flushed, a vein throbbing in his temple. "What did you just say to me?" I said no, I repeated, my voice shaking but holding firm. "Just stop. What are you going to do? Yell at her? For singing a song? For telling the truth?" The truth. I'd said it out loud. The word hung there between us, a declaration of war. For a moment I thought he was going to strike me. His hand clenched into a fist. I braced myself. But he wouldn't do that. Not here. Not in front of the whole town. His authority didn't come from brute force, but from the illusion of unwavering, righteous control. Hitting his own son would shatter that illusion forever. So he used the only weapon he had left, his words. He looked at me, his eyes suddenly cold and empty, and the anger was replaced by something far worse, dismissal. "You are not my son," he said, each word a perfectly crafted dagger. He didn't shout it. He spoke it with a chilling finality, loud enough for those nearby to hear. He looked past me, at Lena, with a look of pure contempt. Then he turned, his back ramrod straight, and walked away. My mother, her face pale and her eyes filled with a terrible conflict, hesitated for a second, her gaze flicking between me and her husband. Then, as she always did, she followed him. The spell was broken. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of hushed, frantic conversations. People started getting up, folding their chairs, avoiding my eyes as if my defiance was a contagious disease. My friends, the ones I'd grown up with, the ones who had been laughing just 10 minutes ago, gathered their things and hurried away, not even giving me a backward glance. I was standing alone in the middle of the town square, an outcast in my own home. I had torched my entire life with a single word. I felt a presence beside me and turned. Lena had come down from the stage. She was standing a few feet away, her old guitar now strapped over her shoulder. The stage lights behind her created a halo effect, but her face was in shadow. We stood there for a moment in the swirling chaos of the dispersing crowd. Two islands in a sea of judgment. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Her voice was quiet, without a trace of the power it held when she sang. "He wasn't going to stop," I said, my voice hoarse. "I couldn't just watch." "I can take care of myself," she said, though not unkindly. She looked past me, into the darkness where my father had disappeared. A strange, worried expression crossed her face. "But you have no idea what you've just done. You think this is just about hurt feelings and old ideas." She finally looked me in the eye, and what I saw there sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just sadness or defiance anymore. It was fear. "It's not?" I asked, confused. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My grandmother told me everything. You need to be careful now. It wasn't just whispers and broken windows that drove the Garcias away." That single sentence hung in the air, colder than the night that was settling around us. "What do you mean?" I asked, my own fears starting to rise. "The night before they left," Lena said, her eyes dark with a borrowed memory. "Someone cut the brake lines on their car. Mr. Garcia found it before he took his family on the highway the next morning. They never called the police. They knew it wouldn't matter. They just packed what was left and were gone before the sun came up. It was a final warning. Get out or get hurt. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just about ugly words and social pressure. This was violent. This was dangerous. The tradition my father so fiercely defended had teeth and claws. I looked around the now mostly empty town square, at the familiar storefronts and the clock tower of the town hall. It all looked different now, sinister. The rot wasn't just in the town's foundations. It was venomous. Who? I breathed, though I was terrified of the answer. Lena just shook her head. It doesn't matter who did it. It matters who let it happen, who looked the other way. That's the real poison here. I went home to a house that was no longer a home. The front door was unlocked, but the air inside was thick with a silence more menacing than any argument. My father was in his study, the door shut. My mother was in the kitchen, pretending to wipe down an already spotless counter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Your father? He's very disappointed," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "He said I wasn't his son," I replied, the words tasting like ash. "He was angry," she whispered, but there was no conviction in it. We both knew he meant it. That night I packed a bag. There was nothing for me here anymore. The foundation of my world had been a lie, and staying would mean becoming a part of that lie. I left a note on the kitchen table, a simple, painful goodbye. I didn't know where to go. I ended up driving to the edge of town near Lena's grandmother's house. I saw a light on, and, on impulse, I knocked. Lena opened the door. We talked for hours, sitting on her porch steps while her grandmother slept inside. I told her everything about my life, the blind loyalty, the slow, dawning shame. She told me about hers, about moving from place to place, never quite belonging, about a strength forged in isolation. For the first time, I wasn't talking to an outsider. I was talking to the only person who understood the truth of Harmony Creek. Over the next week, the town's reaction was exactly what Lena predicted. I was a ghost. People I had known my entire life looked right through me. My father treated me as if I didn't exist. But something else was happening. Lena's song hadn't just exposed the hate, it had shaken the silence. People started talking. Not openly, but in hushed tones in the grocery store, over back fences. The story of the Garcias' brake lines, a secret held by a few, started to leak out, passed from person to person like a forbidden text. The song had given a name to the unease that many had felt, but had been too scared to voice. The resolution came in a way I never expected. It wasn't a town hall meeting or a dramatic confrontation. It was smaller, quieter. Mrs. Gable, whose son was one of my former friends, brought a casserole to Lena's grandmother. Mr. Henderson, the farmer, anonymously left a crate of fresh vegetables on their porch. One by one, small cracks appeared in the wall of silence. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a recognition. The biggest crack came from my own mother. A week after the festival, she found me sitting in my car by the town lake. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a few $100 and an old photograph of my father as a boy, smiling, standing next to his own father. "He wasn't always like this," she said, her eyes full of a sorrow that spanned decades. "His father, he was harder. He taught your dad that any change was a threat, that fear was the only way to keep things safe. He's wrong, I know he is, but he's also trapped." It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. It was her way of saying she loved me, and that she was a prisoner too. I left Harmony Creek the next day. Lena stayed. She said her work there wasn't done. We promised to stay in touch. Two people bound by a single song that had broken one world and started to build another. The wall of hatred didn't crumble overnight. But Lena's song had been the first decisive blow. It was the note of truth that had resonated deep inside the town's hollow heart, creating a fracture that could never be repaired. It proved that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't a mob or a tradition, but a single voice, singing its truth into the dark and waiting for the echo. I drove away knowing that echo had just begun.